Thank you for tuning into the second video about colonization and imperialism of Africa by Europeans. Last we left off, I was kind of cut off talking about how Europeans kind of felt like they were better than the rest of the world, almost like it was a burden that they had to take care of other native people from other countries, trying to educate them and provide them with civilization. Although today, looking back, we realize that these places had their own different types of civilization and something that the Europeans just didn't recognize as being civilization themselves. I decided to share a famous cartoon with you that is called White Man's Burden. It's famous in the United States, published in Detroit, and it depicts a man labeled the United States, basically carrying a native who is portrayed, of course, as uncivilized and wearing some sort of traditional garb, basically showing them being dragged up to the schoolhouse, dragged up to provide them with some sort of education. So it's kind of a criticism of white man's burden, that it's their burden to take care of these other nations they're invading, essentially. Now, things kind of got chaotic when it came to the conquering of Africa and turning things into colonies. Some colonies were starting to border each other in places like France and England and Germany. They started to not get along, and there was fear that war would break out over colonies because they had so many different concerns. They came together in what's called the Berlin Conference in 1884. And they set up rules for how they were going to split up Africa, trying to ensure that every one of these European nations that started colonizing Africa had a chance to kind of have some say. And what they basically were setting up was spheres of influence. So places like northwestern Africa, like Morocco and Algeria, that region had a lot of French influence, and Tunisia and stuff like that. Whereas the UK had a lot of influence in Egypt, all the way down the eastern coast to South Africa. So they basically divided up Africa for Europeans. Once again, not taking any African influence or any of their consideration in doing so. Here you kind of see a map that shows you all of that. You can see the French colonies are up in the northwest, and you see how the United Kingdom kind of has a path from the northeast, from Egypt all the way down to South Africa. If it weren't for those Germans kind of blocking their path, they might have a gigantic railroad essentially from north to south. But you see that each of these European nations kind of divided up and took a part of Africa, part of the deal. Now, of course, there were people that were against imperialism in Europe. Not everyone was in support of this idea of conquering other people. Many anti-imperialists argued that we were basically doing a double standard, that these European nations were promoting democracy in Europe, but not promoting democracy now in Africa. So remember, we had democracy now forming in France. We have more democracy forming in the UK. We have more democracy forming in Germany. And despite more democracy being supported in Europe, they're not giving democracy to Africa. So these Europeans are kind of having a double standard here. Now, just to give you an idea of how much of the world became imperialized by Europeans, you can see on this chart the percentage of land controlled by colonial powers. So places like Polynesia and places like Australia and Africa had almost all their country was owned by Europeans or the United States. So we see a lot of dominance by Europeans in the U.S., a lot of it mainly because of their military strength, because of their advanced weaponry at this time. Here's another look at some of those empires around the world, so beyond the maps we saw earlier. Now, of course, there were a lot of negative effects from imperialism. For example, deforestation and taking away resources from Africa certainly devastated some regions. There was a lot of mining that destroyed some of the natural habitat and some of the resources that were available and some of the forests that were available. And that still continues today as corporations have chunks of Africa as part of their property, and they're using those resources in ways that may not be benefiting the long-term Africa. You also, of course, saw the rise of slavery to the point that we had African tribes kidnapping other African tribes to sell them into slavery. Essentially, the United States and Europeans would take tribes from the coast, give them guns, and encourage them to go inland and take people to be sold. So we saw that imperialism led to more slavery in our history. Another effect, of course, of imperialism is kind of the devastation on families and on people of Africa. Certainly, you saw a lot of punishments issued by the imperialist powers. Certainly, you saw some devastating photos like this of those punishments that had taken place for some sort of misbehavior, some sort of unwanted activity. Now, some of the other short-term effects, certainly you had Africans under European rule for a time being, and a big part of this was also spreading of Western culture. So you had things like religion being spread throughout Africa from Europeans, so kind of replacing some of the traditional religions, replacing some of the traditional political units. So basically a lot of kings and princes and different traditional powers that had been in charge in Africa now were being replaced by European powers or being replaced by other African tribes because everything was kind of being thrown into an imbalance. And lastly, there was kind of a change from focusing on food to cash crops because now Europeans demanded specific goods. So you weren't really growing stuff for yourself. You were growing stuff to be sent off to the UK or France or some other country in Europe. So the African people weren't focusing on feeding themselves anymore, which certainly can lead to some devastation as well. Now, some of the long-term effects, you do see transportation, education, medical care kind of all improve from the European influence. They bring those. So railroads start getting built all throughout Africa to transport goods, and that actually does end up helping. Education, they do bring schools and kind of the European way of having schoolhouses and teaching people the native languages of Europeans. So they start spreading different types of education into Africa, not just the kind of traditional education people had received before. And also they start bringing in medicines from Europe that Africans had not had influence with and starts being able to cut back on some of the diseases that we had heard about earlier. You also start seeing, because of this imperialist powers, you start seeing nations form and you start seeing nationalist movements behind them. So countries like Ethiopia begin to form where they become basically a national powerhouse, an actual country within Africa. And you also start to see conflicts between Europeans and Africa, like between the UK and the Germans, who are kind of fighting for the ability to have that East Coast pathway, East Coast of Africa as their own. But also this interaction between people leads to just new ideas brought from the African people, new ideas brought from the Europeans, and kind of a new emphasis on different types of crops as well. So Europeans benefit as well from a lot of things they learn from the Africans too. And of course, the borders change.